Chapter 7. The Domestic Manners of the Musketeers. When D'Artagnan had left the Louvre and consulted his friends what he ought to do with his portion of the 40 pistols, Athos advised him to order a good dinner, and Porthos and Aramis to hire a lackey. The dinner was accomplished on the same day, and the lackey waited at the table. The dinner had been ordered by Athos, and the lackey, who had been provided by Porthos, was a Picard, whom the glorious musketeer had enlisted on that very day for that occasion, whilst he was sauntering about on the bridge of La Tournelle, spitting into the stream. Porthos pretended that this occupation was proof of a meditative organization, and had hired him without any other testimonial. The magnificent appearance of the gentleman on whose account he had been hired seduced Planchet, for that was the name of the Picard. He had, indeed, been slightly disappointed when he found on his arrival that the situation he expected was already held by a brother lackey of the name of Mousqueton, and Porthos told him that his menage, though on a large scale, did not admit of 2 servants, and that he must therefore wait on D'Artagnan. But when he attended at the dinner which his master gave, and saw him, when paying, draw from his pocket a handful of gold, he believed his fortune made, and thanked heaven that he had fallen into the possession of such a Croesus. In that opinion he remained until the feast was ended, and he made up for his long abstinence by an attack on the remnants. But on making his master's bed, the visions of Planchet all vanished. There was only that one bed in the chambers, which consisted merely of an anteroom and a bedroom. Planchet slept upon a coverlet with which D'Artagnan from that time forward dispensed, taken from D'Artagnan's bed. Athos, on his part, had a valet, whom he had drilled to his service in a manner peculiar to himself, and whom he called Grimaud. He was a very taciturn, this worthy signor, we mean Athos, not his man. For the first 4 or 5 years that he had lived in the closest intimacy with his companions, Porthos and Aramis, these two had often seen him smile, but never remembered to have heard him laugh. His words were brief and expressive, saying what he wished them to express, but no more. He employed no ornaments or embellishments whatever. Although Athos was scarcely 30, and was possessed of great personal and mental attractions, no one ever knew him to have had a mistress. He never spoke of the female sex, and although he did not prevent such conversations from others, it was evident from bitter and misogynist remarks that it was disagreeable to him. His reserve, austerity, and silence made him almost an old man, and he had therefore accustomed Grimaud, that he might not interrupt his habits, to obey a simple gesture or even a motion of his lips. He never addressed him orally but in extreme cases. Sometimes Grimaud, who feared his master like fire, but at the same time was greatly attached to him, believed he understood him perfectly, rushed forward to execute his orders, and did something directly contrary to what was wanted. Then Athos shrugged his shoulders, and in cold blood belaboured him soundly. On such days he spoke a little. Porthos, as it is easy to see, had a character diametrically opposed to that of Athos. He not only spoke a great deal, but in a loud voice. It must be owned, to do him justice, that it was of little consequence to him whether anyone attended to him or not. He talked for the mere pleasure of speaking, or of hearing himself talk, and talked too of everything but the sciences, which he never alluded to, but to express the inveterate hate he had from his infancy entertained towards savants. He had not such an aristocratic air as Athos, and the sense of his inferiority on that point had, at the commencement of their connection, made him often unjust toward that gentleman whom he endeavoured to surpass by the splendour of his dress. But in his simple uniform coat merely, and by the manner in which he carried himself, Athos took at once the rank to which he was entitled, and sent the foppish Porthos back to the second place. Porthos consoled himself by making Monsieur de Treville's antechamber, and the guard-room of the Louvre ring with the account of his conquests, a subject upon which Athos never spoke, and boasted of none lower than a foreign princess who was deeply enamored of him. An old proverb says, like master, like man. Let us then pass from the valley of Athos to the valley of Porthos, from Gamaude to Mousqueton. Mousqueton was a Norman whose pacific name of Boniface his master had changed to the much more sonorous and warlike one of Mousqueton. He had entered Porthos' service on the sole payment of dress, board, and lodging, but in a sumptuous manner, and he only demanded 2 hours a day to provide for his other wants. Porthos had accepted the bargain, and things went on wonderfully well. He had old doublets and cloaks cut up and turned in a manner that made Mousqueton cut a very good figure. As to Aramis, whose character we believe we have sufficiently explained, and which, as well as those of his comrades, we shall more fully develop hereafter, his lackey was named Bazin. Thanks to the hopes which his master entertained of some day taking orders, he was always dressed in black as became a churchman's servant. He was of the province of Berry, 35 or 40 years of age, mild, peaceable, and fat, and passed his leisure in reading devotional treatises. He was dexterous in preparing a dinner for two of excellent quality, though of few dishes. In all else he was dumb, blind, deaf, and of approved fidelity. Now that we know, at least superficially, the masters and the men, let us turn to their habitations. Athos dwelt in the Rue Férou, at 2 paces from the Luxembourg. His habitation, or lodging, consisted of 2 small rooms in a very neatly furnished house, whose mistress was still young and pretty, but ogled him in vain. Some few fragments of long-departed splendor adorned the walls of this modest lodging, such as a richly mounted sword which looked of the age of Francis I, and of which the handle alone, encrusted with precious stones, might be worth about 200 pistols. Nevertheless, Athos, even in moments of the greatest distress, could never be persuaded to dispose of or pawn it. The sword had long excited the envy of Porthos, who would willingly have given 10 years of his life for the possession of it. One day, when, as he said, he had an appointment with the Duchess, he endeavored to borrow it of Athos, but his friend, without saying a word, emptied his pockets of all his money and trinkets, purses, points, and gold chains, and offered them to Porthos, but as for the sword, he said it was fixed to its place, and must only leave it when its master quitted the lodging. Besides this sword, he had the portrait of a nobleman of the time of Henry III, dressed with great elegance and adorned with the order of the Saint-Esprit, and this portrait had some slight resemblance to Athos, a certain family likeness, which denoted that this great noble, a royal knight, was his ancestor. Lastly, a box of splendid jewelry work with the same arms as the sword and portrait completed a mantle decoration which clashed fearfully with the furniture. Athos always carried the key of this box, but one day he opened it before Porthos, and Porthos could bear witness that it contained only letters and papers, love letters and family records, no doubt. Porthos inhabited a lodging of vast size and of most sumptuous appearance in the Rue de Vieux Colombier. Every time Porthos passed the windows of this house, at one of which Mousqueton always appeared in splendid livery, he raised his hand and head, saying, "Behold my habitation." But no one ever found him at home, nor did he ever ask anyone in, and it was therefore impossible to form an idea of the reality of those riches which this sumptuous appearance promised. As for Aramis, he dwelt in a small apartment, comprising a drawing-room, a dining-room, and a sleeping-chamber, which were situate on the ground floor and had access to a small garden, fresh, green, shady, and quite impenetrable to the eyes of the surrounding neighborhood. We have already had occasion to know how D'Artagnan was lodged, and we have already formed an acquaintance with his lackey, Monsieur Planchet. D'Artagnan, who was naturally very curious, as men of talent generally are, made every effort to find out who Athos, Porthos, and Aramis really were, for, under one of those assumed appellations, each of those young men concealed his real name. It was evident they were of good origin, too, particularly Athos, who might be known as a nobleman at a league's distance. He therefore tried from Porthos to get some information concerning Athos and Aramis, and assailed Aramis to find out something concerning Porthos. Unfortunately, Porthos knew no more of the life of his silent comrade than of which has been told. It was said that he had met with great misfortunes of the heart, and that a terrible treachery had forever poisoned the happiness of this gallant man. What this treachery was, no one knew. As for Porthos, except his real name, with which Monsieur de Treville alone was acquainted, as well as with those of his two comrades also, his life was easily discovered. Vain and indiscreet, he was as easily seen through as crystal. The only thing which could mislead the investigator would have been a belief in all the good which he announced of himself. As for Aramis, with the appearance of entire openness, he was enveloped in mystery. He replied but little to the questions put to him about others, and entirely eluded those which related to himself. One day D'Artagnan, having questioned him a long time about Porthos, and having learned the report of his love affair with a princess, wished to ascertain something of a similar nature as he regarded himself. "And you, my dear companion," said he, "I have an opinion that you are familiar with coats of arms. Witness a certain handkerchief." Aramis was not angry this time, but he put on a most modest air and said affectedly, "My dear fellow, do not forget that I wish to enter the church, and that I fly from all worldly things. That handkerchief was not a love token for me, but it was left by mistake at my house by one of my friends. I was obliged to take it for fear of compromising him and his mistress. As for myself, I am, like Athos, indifferent to these affairs." "But what the devil! You're not an abbé, but a musketeer!" exclaimed D'Artagnan. "A musketeer, my dear fellow, for a time, as the cardinal says. A musketeer by accident, but a churchman at heart, believe me. Athos and Porthos have foisted me in to occupy my time. I had, the moment I was going to be ordained, a slight difficulty with— But that does not much interest you, and I take up your valuable time." "On the contrary," said D'Artagnan, "it interests me very much, and I have at present actually nothing to do." "Yes, but I have my breviary to say," replied Aramis, "that some verses to compose, which Madame d'Aiguillon has requested of me, that I must go into the Rue Saint-Honore to buy some rouge for Madame de Chevreuse, so you see, my dear friend, that though you are not in a hurry, I am." And Aramis, tenderly pressing his young companion's hand, took leave of him. D'Artagnan could not, with all his pains, learn any more of his three new friends. He therefore determined to believe that was, at present, said of their past life, and hope for better and more full information from the future. In the meantime, he considered Athos an Achilles, Porthos an Ajax, and Aramis a Joseph. The days of the four young men passed happily on. Athos played, and always with ill luck, yet he never borrowed a sou of his friends, although he lent to them when he could. And when he played on credit, he always awoke his creditor at 6 in the morning to pay him the debt of the evening before. Porthos had his humours. One day, if he gained, he was insolent and splendid, and when he lost, he disappeared entirely for a time, and then came back wan and thin, but with his pockets stored with coin. As for Aramis, he never played, but he was the worst musketeer and the most unpleasant guest possible. He always wanted to study, even in the middle of dinner, when all expected him to spend 2 or 3 hours in the midst of wine and company. Out came his watch, and he would say, rising with a graceful smile and taking leave of the company, that he must consult a casuist with whom he had an appointment. Planchet, D'Artagnan's valet, nobly supported his good fortune. He received 30 sous a day, and, during a month, entered the lodgings gay as a chaffinch and affable to his master. When the wind of adversity began to blow on the household of the Rue des Fossoyeurs, that is to say, when Louis XIII's 40 pistols were eaten up, or nearly so, he began to utter complaints, to which D'Artagnan found very nauseous, Porthos indelicate, and Aramis ridiculous. On this account Athos advised D'Artagnan to dismiss the rascal. Porthos wished him to thrash him first, and Aramis declared that a master should never listen to anything but his servant's compliments. "It is very easy for you to talk," replied D'Artagnan. "For you, Athos, who live mutely with Grimaud and forbid him to speak, and consequently can never hear anything unpleasant from him. For you, Porthos, who live magnificently and are a sort of demigod to your valet Mousqueton. For you, in fine, Aramis, who, being always engaged in thought, make your servant Bazin, who is a mild, religious man, respect you. But I, who am without stability or resources, I, who am neither musketeer nor guardsman, what can I do to inspire Planchet with affection, terror, or respect?" "The thing is weighty," answered the three friends. "The discipline of your establishment is in the balance. With valets, as with women, it is necessary to prove master at once if you wish to keep them with you. Let us therefore reflect." D'Artagnan reflected and resolved to thrash Planchet provisionally, which was executed as conscientiously as he acted in all other affairs. Then, after having drubbed him soundly, he forbade him to quit his service without permission. "For," said he, "the future cannot be unfavorable to me. I have an infallible expectation of better times, and your fortune is therefore made if you remain with me. Yes, I am too good a master to let your prospects be sacrificed by giving you the notice you demand." This manner of proceeding gave the Musketeers great respect for D'Artagnan's policy, and Planchet was seized with equal admiration and spoke no more of leaving him. The lives of the four young men were now passed alike. D'Artagnan, who had formed no habits whatever, as he had but just arrived from the provinces and fallen into the midst of a world entirely new to him, immediately assumed those of his friends. They rose at 8 in the winter and at 6 in the summer, and went to take the countersign and see what was doing at Monsieur de Treville's. D'Artagnan, though he was not a musketeer, performed the duties of one with great punctuality. He was always on guard, as he always accompanied that one of his friends whose turn it chanced to be. Everyone at the hotel knew him and regarded him as a comrade. Monsieur de Treville, who at the first glance took his measure and had a sincere affection for him, did not cease to recommend him to the king. The Three Musketeers had, on their parts, a great affection for their young companion. The friendship which united these four men, and the necessity of seeing each other 3 or 4 times a day, whether the affair were one of honor or of pleasure, made them run after each other like shadows, and they were always to be seen seeking each other from the Luxembourg to the Place de Saint-Sulpice, or from the Rue de Vieux Colombier to the Luxembourg. In the meantime, the promises of Monsieur de Treville were fulfilled. One fine day, the king commanded Monsieur le Chevalier des Essarts to take D'Artagnan as a recruit into his company of guards. It was not without a sigh that D'Artagnan put on the uniform, which he would have exchanged for that of the Musketeers at the cost of 10 years of his existence. But Monsieur de Treville promised him that favor after cadetship of 2 years, a cadetship which, however, might be abridged if he should find an opportunity of distinguishing himself by some brilliant action. D'Artagnan retired with this promise and entered in his service the next day. Then it was that Athos, Porthos, and Aramis mounted guard in turn with D'Artagnan when the duty came to him. The company of Monsieur des Essarts, therefore, on the day that it received the youthful Gascon, received 4 men in the place of 1.